But today we're going to talk about power. Power is a great thing, right? If you have it. But what if you don't have it? What if you don't have power? What if you're powerless? How many of you love to be powerless? You're in some situation, you're like, oh yeah, let me just, everything that happens to me, I'm just a victim all my life, right? Everybody hates that. That's terrible, right? Power, here's my thesis for today. Power is one of the most central qualities of God. It's his power that makes all of his other attributes sustainable. Right? That God's greatest attribute is probably love or mercy, but it's his power to always be loving. That's what makes love so powerful, is that all of God's power is behind it. Right? The cross, forgiveness. God's power is behind that, which means he never fails to forgive. He never fails to show up. He never fails to go all in anything he does. And so it's God's power that makes God powerful. Power is a huge topic in the supernatural world, right? And so what I'm going to do very quickly is I'm going to review where we've been in the last couple of weeks, and then we're going to jump right into two scriptures. And today I want to talk about power, not so much as do I have it or do I not have it. That's really a different lesson. But what is power? How does the Bible teach us to understand power and authority and those kinds of things? Power and authority are sort of synonyms, right? That someone who can control something, right? And that could be institutional power, like the power of the state of California, the power of the federal government, the power of the police force, the power of our military, right? The power of a parent over a child or a teacher over a student, right? That's one kind of power, right? But there's also ideological power, the power to persuade, right? The power to convince someone of something, right? And then there's supernatural power, like magical or mystical power, the kind of power that makes the sun shine or keep burning, the kind of power that keeps the earth from spinning out of orbit and plunging into the sun. Right? There's all kinds of power, scientific sorts of power, right? Newtonian kind of power, right? For you guys who are into science and physics. There's different kinds of power. And what I want to suggest today is that every single manifestation of power that you've experienced was made by and for God's purposes. God created the idea of power. God is in the power business, so to speak. If there's an authority, a power, a physical, anything that controls anything, God invented those things. God is those things, and he wants those things to be used for his purposes. Now, we all understand that that's not the world we live in. That power is abused all the time. People are overpowered all the time. If that wasn't the case, we wouldn't have a sex trafficking issue like we have in this country or on the planet. The largest industry on the planet. Sex. Human beings. Dwarfs the economies of most countries. Right? That's an abuse of power. We all understand that. Some of the stuff that's gone on up the street here in Hollywood. An abuse of power. Right? Maybe some of you have been abused by power. Manipulated by a spouse, hopefully not. Or a boss. Or someone else who had authority over you. Power. But before we get into power, what have we said in the last couple weeks? God has a divine and a human family, right? We've talked about this, right? You can read the scriptures from the last couple of sermons. God's divine family has unique qualities, right? Different powers than the human family, right? That God's divine family, call them angels, demons, that all those different things, okay, apply. Those Elohim, those angels, those powers, they have unique qualities. And some of those qualities are different than us. For example, the invisibility. Unless you've got a cloak hanging around, none of us have invisibility going on, right? No? It's Potter's, it's too old now, right? Nobody really remembers Harry anymore, right? But invisibility, man, that would be like a great power to have, right? I can't imagine wanting to use it the right way, though. So maybe it's better that I don't have it. But they have other unique powers like timelessness, eternality, right? That these invisible powers, they have different kinds of powers than you and I have. They can be in any place throughout historical time. You and I can't travel through time, but they can, right? As an example. Some of those divine beings we talked about, those sons had very specific and kind of magnificent power, right? And they did things, Genesis 6, they had authority over women in the Old Testament. They had different kinds of authority. And some of these divine beings do battle. Daniel 7 is a passage that we looked at. But some of these, have names like Raphael or Gabriel or other angels like that have very specific kind of roles and power that's really hard to imagine. Right? Awesome power without the itty-bitty living space. And they can intervene in history. Yes, that's a 31-year-old joke from Aladdin. Robin. I was reading it anyway. What a genius. Unbelievable. No one should be that awesome and that smart, But they can intervene in history, right? They can do these things, right? That's God's family. Let's talk about power. Matthew 24. Here we go. So just look for the power politics in these words. Immediately, this is Jesus talking about the end times, right? It's a famous apocalyptic passage in the New Testament. And it says, immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened. So he's quoting from Joel chapter 2. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Right? At the return of Jesus Christ, look what's going to happen. The sun is going to be darkened. The moon won't give its light. The stars are going to fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Some translations say the heavenly beings will be shaken. Right? Obviously, this is poetic language, right? But what does it symbolize? What does it mean? Is the sun really going to go out? Is the moon really going to stop giving its light? Well, if the sun goes out, the moon goes out too, right? We understand that, right? How does the sun shine or the moon? It doesn't have its own light source, right? And the stars are going to fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Whatever this means specifically, what it means broadly is that the things that seem really stable and permanent, they're not so stable and they're not so permanent. That when Jesus returns, the world that you and I know it is going to fall apart and be destroyed so it can be recreated. And that those heavenly bodies, those things that seem like they're fixed, they're not fixed. They're fixed from our perspective. I can't drop the moon out of the sky, but Jesus can. I can't turn off the lights on planet Earth, but the return of Jesus will do exactly that. The lights are going to go out. Now, if you live in Texas, you've already experienced some of that, right? But, sorry, maybe it's too soon. Everybody knows that there's rolling blackouts in Texas, right? We should be praying about that, okay, right? That our grids are under, anyway. Okay, whatever you think about that. Right? The heavenly bodies will be shaken. That these things that we think are supposed to be permanent, they're not so permanent, right? That God has more power. God has power, and that the physical world that we see, it only seems permanent, but it's not. It's not. It, like us, has an end date. It has an expiration date on it. From the USGA, the ultimate supernatural God authority, or something like that. Whatever. Anyway, I just made that up just now. Sorry if it wasn't any good. Colossians 2. Colossians 2. I love this one, right? Let's go over there. And for context, we're going to back it up here a little bit. I've just got only the specific verse on the verse. It's starting in verse 13. We'll read. And you who were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your sinful nature, God made you alive with Christ. Paul is talking about how the Colossian Christians became Christians. He's trying to explain the process of going from death to life. And he says, well, you were dead because of sin, And the uncircumcision for your sinful nature, if you're not a church person or a religious person, that's just a metaphor for an old Jewish ritual that once performed made you part of the people of God, all right? He says you were dead and uncircumcised. You were disconnected from God. But God did something to you. He made you alive. He took someone dead and he said, I'm going to make you alive. How did he do that? He forgave our sins and he canceled the written code with its regulations. He's talking about the Old Testament law, right? The need to be perfect. The need to fulfill all of the rules to have a relationship with God. He says he canceled that with its regulations and it stood opposed to us. He took it away, nailing it to the cross. And here's the cool part. And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. How many of you have come across this verse before? Right? We've seen this verse, right? We've read it. What's happening here, though? As we're getting a little bit more of a supernatural perspective from our studies, we should begin to read these kinds of verses that formerly we read right by. They should be resonating a little bit more with us, right? He disarmed the powers and authorities. Okay, military guys. Let's pick on Orlando. Where's Orlando? I know he's here somewhere. Orlando. Have you ever had to disarm somebody? Not that close? Yeah. you did your killing from a long way away, right? But you don't have to but think about what is it to go up to somebody and take their gun from them? Right. Risky. Really risky. And you got to know what you're doing. What if you don't know what you're doing? What's going to happen? You're going to die. Jesus disarmed the powers and authorities. Well, who are these? I won't get into the Greek lessons here, but the two words that are used here, they mean world authority and governmental authorities. The empire, basically. He says, when Jesus died, he says, you know what? I took all of these human rules, like Nero and the empire, and all these rules about how to be a good person and how to be a citizen, and I destroyed all of those things, and I said, no, it's my rules now. That at the cross, Jesus abolished human rules and human authority. Not completely, we'll see that in a minute. But he says he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Well, how did this work exactly? Oops, that's not the slide that I thought was next. Give me a minute. Nope, that's not the one either. Well, I guess we'll get there in a minute. Oh, yeah, sorry, I changed my name. That's okay. He disarmed the power. So what does that mean? What that means is that when Jesus died, how did Jesus die, for example? On whose authority was he killed? Maybe not just the person, but like what allowed him to be killed? All right, so the Romans for sure were involved. What else? Who else was involved? Pilate was involved, right? What about the Jews? They were involved, right? And so the Jews kind of had this religious set of rules. And so it's the religious law that said this man must die because he's made these claims, right? All right, and then Pilate, of course, very mixed motives probably. But Roman law actually gave them the actual legal power to take his life. So the Jews had the religious power, but only Rome, only the state had the power to take a life. And so these two powers, Jesus surrendered to these two human powers. He surrendered to a set of laws that he knew he was about to die to abolish. Remember from right here, right? He abolished those things in his flesh, right? So he surrendered to those, and he surrendered to the Romans. He did not need to do that. He could have walked away. But he says, no, I'm going to disarm them by surrendering to them, and when I come back, it'll be my way, not their way. Power's a funny thing, though. All of us have difficulty with power. I do. Right? Power is mixed, especially when we don't have it. So here's a scripture. My good friend Darren, who was here a couple weeks ago, you guys heard he and his wife Susan share communion a couple weeks back. Power. Romans 13. Paul says, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except that which God has established. Hold on to that for a minute, right? No authority. The government authority, It's from God. And you're going, I know the question, but what about this and what about that? We'll get there. But the idea of authority, God invented the idea of authority. Right? As a notion, as a concept. The idea that someone would have power over another person. God invented that. It didn't just spring up. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Wow, okay. Your boss, established by God. The president, the Senate, if there's authority in your life, it is from God. It is from God. This is really important. Because I think what we tend to do in our struggles is we go, yeah, but they're using it badly, so I can. We all do this, right? We rationalize. But I want to, before we get there, authority is from God. If your boss has it, if your bank has it, if the IRS has it, if Gavin Newsom has it, or pick your favorite governor, the governor, whoever it is you love. If there's authority in your life, God created that authority, and He expects us to do what? Submit to the governing authorities. Not because they're doing well, not because the people have good motives, but because God says, no, this is what I have established. And here in America, we're just rebellious. This country was founded on rebelling against authority. The authority of the throne, the authority of the king. The American Revolution, you guys remember that? And Jay's like, hi, I remember. I was there, No, I'm just kidding. Wow. I don't know who else is older. Maybe Tony may remember too. These are the old guys, But actually, I'm older than Tony, I think, maybe. Or I'm not sure, but close. At any rate, but he says, no, these are from God. So he who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And I'll just let the Bible say, what happens? Swift judgment, right? For those rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Do what is right and he will commend you. We've all had this experience. If you're in the military, you totally know this, right? You had good officers and bad officers. We've had good bosses and bad bosses, right? We've had good teachers and bad teachers. We've had good camp counselors and bad camp counselors. We've all experienced people who throw their weight around and you kind of go, man, this guy's killing me. Or this girl's killing me. And maybe some of us have been those people. Authority is from God. And so when we see it, we have to say, okay, let me just take away what's happening here. That thing that I'm pushing back on, no, that's from God. And if I decide I'm going to push back on it, then I got to deal with God. And he says, oh, by the way, you may also have consequences from the one in authority, right? For he is God's servant to do you good. Our minds are going crazy right about now. We're like, yeah, bro, but you don't understand. That guy, he did not want my best. He had it in for me. I know it. I can prove it. I have the paperwork to, whatever. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he doesn't bear the sword for naught. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. We're not going to belabor this. Authority comes from God in any form we find it. In any form we find it. This has to be our baseline as Christians. Right? Now we're going to get into some particulars here in just a minute. But this has to be our baseline. Why? Because power and authority are God's idea. They're God's idea. Whether it's the power of physics, the power of a relationship, the power of a legal principle, the power of money. If it has power, God says, no, that's my stuff. I made power. Because I am power. Pay your taxes. We'll just leave it at that. But he says, listen, if you owe, pay. Taxes, revenue, respect, honor, pay. I think it's interesting that he throws respect and honor here at the end. It's not just a money thing. Right? But respect for authority sometimes means respecting the authority even if you don't respect the person. This happens all the time. all the time. Colossians 1, here's the why. Speaking of Jesus, by him all things were created. Things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. This is the justification for Romans 13. Why does Paul lean in on Romans 13 the way he does? Because this is Paul's supernatural reality. That when Jesus created the cosmos, the stars, the sky, the elements, the earth, the planets, the galaxies, when Jesus created those things, he also created invisible things like power. Thrones, the Greek word is thronos. It just means basically kingdoms, the authority of a king. Right? He doesn't have any one particular king in mind. Rulers and authorities, powers. The Greek word here is exousia, and it means invisible powers. It can mean supernatural beings. It can also mean something as simple as gravity. But it's a power that exists that's not seeable with the human eye. You guys can all use your imagination. There's all different kinds of those things. Jesus made these things. Why? They were created by him, but for him. For him. That without power, Jesus can't have a kingdom. Without power, Jesus can't keep his promises. Without power, Jesus can't rise from the dead. Without power, the earth and the galaxy would collapse. He sustains all things by his powerful word, Hebrews 1. Right? That without power, everything that we know collapses into a black hole or worse. Power. Power. All power is divine power. So let's think about this for a minute. So what happens when somebody abuses it? Because I know that's what we're all thinking. We're going, yeah, bro, I get it. Biblically, I'm following you. Okay, but what about reality? What about my life? Hey, sure, I know we're all thinking that. I'm thinking it too. Even as I'm saying this, I'm thinking I should come to the punchline here, Here's the problem that we have with assessing power. First of all, we assume that we're just. When we feel like we're abused, we think, well, I know how I'm supposed to be treated. And if it were me, I would do it differently. We all say those things because we assume that we're just people, that we can figure things out, that we can examine a situation and that we know what should be done and that the person that's doing it doesn't know what they're doing, or that God isn't quite, God, why did you make this happen when this would have been better for me or better for my church or better for my child? Or like we do these things all the time. We do them automatically. We rationalize because we assume that we're just. And that our view is the right view. But it seldom is. It seldom is. We also imagine ourselves to be good judges of character or motives. We think, well, I know the reason that you really said that was X, Y, and Z. I mean, how many times have we done that, right? Someone apologizes and we're like, I don't know. I hear the words, but, I know you said you were going to be there and you gave me a good excuse, but I don't know, right? We undermine each other all the time in these ways, right? We have trouble because we have these two things in our brain that say, I know what's best, and I'm a good judge of circumstances, I'm a good judge of character. I'm better than God. Instead of just surrendering to the situation or power, I'm like, well, no, let me figure out why I don't need to do that. This is like our number one thing as people. Here's a great quote that I read from this biblical scholar, John Walton, who I read a lot. I'm going to read it, and then he's a scholar, so I may have to explain it just a little bit. Yahweh, God, is not just responsible for managing the cosmos, the universe, but is seen as the originator of all of its control attributes. He is not within the system, but operates outside the system. Sorry for the typo. The cosmic phenomena are not manifestations of his attributes, but instruments of his sovereignty. I love that part. Right? The cosmic phenomena, right? Earth, sunrises, things that happen in the universe around us, right? Beauty. They're not manifestations of God's attributes, but they're instruments of his sovereignty. That God is controlling those things. He makes the sunrise. He creates the starry skies. He creates the light shows that we see when the sun sets over the Pacific, right? That no control attributes have any autonomous existence. What is he saying? He's saying, listen, in a very scholarly kind of way, he's saying that if there's a control, if there's a power in the universe, natural or unnatural, human or divine, earthly or heavenly, God created that, right? He calls those things control attributes, powers. But because God is outside of the system, all of those things that God is doing, they're done not because he's God, but because he is sovereign, because he rules, that it's God's power that makes these things real. And then he says, no attributes have any autonomous existence. What does that mean? That none of the good and beautiful things that we see in the universe could exist without God. They can't exist apart from the deity. That there's no such thing as beauty if God doesn't make it. Right? That the sun doesn't just rise by itself. No, God created these things. And what Walton is trying to, I think, get us to understand, at least this is how I interpret this, is that if there's something that amazes me, God decided to do that and God controls it. And why do I need to know that? Because I need to respond to God's power in the right way. All these realities, I need to respond. Like, how do I respond to the overwhelming reality that God is in charge of everything that happens in the universe and in my life, including the bad or not so great bosses that I've had? What do I do? How do I respond to this? Well, the first thing I have to remember is that Jesus will deal with all abuse of power. Now, this one's really important because if I don't really believe this, what am I going to do? I'm going to try and deal with that. I'm going to deal with that abuse of power, right? And I could lash out. I could rebel. I could overpower. I could quit that job and go be somebody else's boss. I could go into business for myself, whatever it is. But if I don't believe that Jesus will deal with the injustice, I have no other option than to do it myself. But I have to believe that Jesus will deal with abuse of power, and he will. Here's the text. Then the end will come when he, this is Jesus, delivers the kingdom to God the Father after destroying every rule and authority and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. That when Jesus returns, every kind of power that he's created, it's going to be wiped away, and the only power that will be left is his. All that injustice, it will go away. So what about the people who use God's power? Right? Because we said all power is divine. So what about someone who takes their authority as a business person and decides to use it for evil purposes? When that power, when Jesus returns and that power is destroyed, that person will be destroyed along with it. They will both go away. What about that boss who manipulates, uses his power to cover up financial misdeeds or to cover sexual misconduct or any of these other horrible things that we hear about? They're relying on the fact that they have a certain power, that God made them the boss. God knew what he was doing, but he gave them the freedom to choose. And if they do the wrong thing, when Jesus comes back, they will go the way of that power. They will be gone. But if I don't really believe that, if I'm not willing to wait for God's justice, I will try and do it myself. I will. Every time. I've done this. I've done it in the last 6 months. We try and take control of our lives as though we had power. How did Jesus respond to power? And we'll close with this. What did he do? Having all of the power, having created the cosmos, having created all of these things we've been talking about, you would think that Jesus would say, well, you know, honestly, I've got the power. You know, and he knew it was coming, right? He would be singing that song, you know. I don't know whose song is that. I don't even know. I don't know, John, you remember? I don't know. It's like from, maybe it's before your time. Yeah, you're old. All I remember is that song was popular in that movie, The Fisher King, which starred Robin Williams. So there's a reason, that's how my brain works. Okay, that's, huh? Snap, right? You remember that movie? Fisher King? Oh, Snap is the name of the song? Snap is the name of the group. Oh, you said, oh, Snap, and I'm like, okay. Now that's like a thing. Okay, right. But somebody remembers, right? Great song. Right? So here's Jesus, and he's singing snap. He's snapping and singing snap. You know, he's got the power. And you go, well, what does he worry about? He didn't have to submit to anybody. But he did. How do we respond to power, especially when it's wrong? Here we are in Philippians 2:5. Well-known passage, but let's read it with a supernatural mindset. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not account equality with God as a thing to be grasped. Note that word, grasped. That's a specific kind of claim, isn't it? To grasp. But emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has exalted him and bestowed upon him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven, and on earth, and under the earth. That should mean something now after the sermon a couple of weeks ago. Remember the little diagram we had? Sheol and all that, right? And every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. This is a power passage. How did Jesus deal with unjust power with the Romans and the Jews? He submitted. He obeyed Romans 13. He said, okay, I'll go. Their law, unjust though it was, they had the legal right to execute him. And he said, okay, I'll go with it. It's the law, I'll go with it. He didn't say, well, it's unjust, you know, and he didn't argue the legal technicalities of his case. He said, I'll go, I'll die. I will obey your law. And then I'll obey the law of death. Notice the phrase, obedient unto death. He obeyed the law of sin and death, which he was above because he was sinless and eternal. Jesus surrendered to power, even though he didn't have to. Jesus surrendered to power. He respected the power even when it was improperly wielded. Even when it was unjustly measured out. He said, I'll submit. I'll die. And again, there's a lot of things that happen in Jesus' death that we could talk about. I'm talking just about the simple decision to say, this thing rules human beings. I'm a divine being, but I'll go ahead and submit to this thing that's made for sinful people. I'll let it win temporarily. I'll allow it to take me. Can you imagine what it might have been like for Jesus hanging on the cross? Feeling death, knowing that all he had to do was basically whisper, away with me, and it would have gone away, and saying, I'll let you have me. Can you imagine the surrender of that? Knowing that you're about to die, knowing that if you just whisper a prayer, you can live, and dying anyway? I like my life way too much for that. But this is surrender to power. To power. This is Jesus showing us, like Seth so eloquently said earlier, showing us how to be vulnerable. If we want to understand God's power, we have to surrender to injustice so that God's power can work through us. It's just what we have to do. I wish I could say that there was a nice, easy way to accomplish this, to experience this in life. I can experience God's perfect justice and mercy if I just avoid conflict. No, you cannot. You will have conflict. Someone will abuse you. Someone will malign you. Someone will use power inappropriately in our lives. And at that moment, I have to decide. Do I believe that all power comes from God, or do I think God is mistaken in this particular situation that pertains to me and makes me uncomfortable? You guys understand? I mean, and that is the decision that we make when we decide to push back and rebel against legitimate or illegitimate authority. We are deciding that we know better than God. We are. That's what we're deciding. And then we wonder why we don't get good results. But even beyond the results, if you surrender to a bad boss and you get a terrible result, you know what you do get? You get to be like Jesus. That's what you get. That's the reward. You know what? It didn't work out for me, but I'm more like my Lord than I was 20 minutes ago before I encountered this situation. And is that enough for us? Is it enough? Every knee will bow. I wonder, how's our bowing going? Are we bowing? And I'm going to share a very short story because we're at 3 o'clock. And we're definitely over time today by a good bit. My wife, years ago, I don't even remember when she started. She prays every morning and every night. We both do. But at some point a number of years back, I don't remember exactly when, I'm lying in bed and I'm praying and I'm kind of roll over and I'm getting ready to go sleep. And Jeannie comes in and she doesn't get in the bed. I'm like, okay. And I fell asleep and didn't think much of it. The next night, I'm laying there in bed, and she comes into the room, she gets all cleaned up, she's ready, and she comes towards the bed, and then she doesn't get into the bed. Well, I realized after 2 or 3 days that she was getting down on her face, on her knees, on her face, on the carpet, just to the other side of her bed, and that she ended every day on her face before God. She's now been doing that for a decade at least. That's her habit. That's her habit. On her knees, she bows on earth. Which means that God will exalt her in heaven. Because she bows now. How's our bowing going? I have trouble bowing. Even after her years of her great example. I'm like, I'm not saying I don't pray. That's not what I'm saying. But man, that habit that I don't feel right unless I'm on my face before I close my eyes. And now it's a habit. She would never miss that. It's a habit. It's who she has become. A woman on her knees. This I think is the place where we understand, I've got to get to this place where I'm okay with surrendering to authority. I'm surrendered to power. Because we don't really have any choice. Jesus did not assume power. He gave up power. He gave it up. He surrendered to the power of imperial authority, of imperial Rome. He surrendered. He surrendered to the power of death. And most of us just have trouble surrendering to our husband or wife's request to dump the coffee in the coffee grounds in the garbage, not leave him in the thing, or whatever it is at your house. I'm not saying that's our thing, but just, Seth has already told enough of my terrible stories today. And for the record, I don't remember ever saying that, but I'm sure I did, so. Power. How's our relationship with power? I got some work to do myself in this area. But God has also given us all the power we need. And I'll just read this quickly, that God has given us the power that raised Jesus from the dead. He's put it inside of us, right? That I have the power that I need. And so I don't need to wrestle and struggle and grapple with power. Jesus is Lord over all power. Do I respond to that by kneeling before not power, but kneeling before Jesus? Because I know that if there's power and influence in my life, and I'm surrendering to that, I'm surrendering to Jesus, not to that person, not to that circumstance, not to that injustice. I'm surrendering to Jesus in that moment. And if we don't have that on straight, we simply won't do it. I can tell you from experience. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great Sunday.